The ushers approached the elderly man with practiced politeness but unwavering firmness. "Sir, this is a ticketed event for invited guests only," they explained, their voices calm but resolute. "We're going to have to ask you to leave." The old man nodded silently, gathering his worn jacket and preparing to leave the auditorium where he had hoped to hear the military band perform melodies he had composed decades ago. As he slowly made his way toward the exit, security personnel began to escort him out, their footsteps echoing against the polished floors. The audience murmured in confusion, but no one dared intervene. Yet, something unexpected was unfolding on the stage, something that would stop everyone in their tracks. The military band abruptly ceased their warm-up, instruments lowering in unison as the conductor's eyes locked on the departing figure. The room fell into a heavy silence before the conductor stepped forward, setting down his baton with quiet authority. His voice rang out, cutting through the confusion like a clarion call. "Ladies and gentlemen, we cannot and will not perform tonight without Master Sergeant Thompson in the audience," he declared. The auditorium erupted into stunned whispers and gasps as the true weight of the moment sank in. This was no ordinary attendee, but a living legend whose presence was essential. Welcome to the Human Stories. Before we continue with this powerful story, tell us in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We're growing every day, and I sincerely thank you for being a part of it. Arlington National Cemetery on a crisp November morning carried the weight of history in every perfectly aligned headstone. The autumn leaves had been cleared away, the grass trimmed to regulation height, and the pathways swept clean for what promised to be one of the most significant military funerals of the year. General Patricia Hammond had died at 78, her distinguished career spanning 4 decades of service that included 2 combat deployments and a tenure as the first female commanding officer of the Army's most elite training facility. The guest list read like a directory of military and political power. 3-star generals, senators, defense contractors, and family members whose own service records stretched back generations. Protocol demanded that seating be arranged by rank, influence, and relationship to the deceased. Every detail had been planned months in advance, every contingency accounted for, every possible disruption anticipated and prevented. Except for the elderly man in the faded dress blues who had somehow slipped past security. Master Chief Petty Officer Miguel Rodriguez had not been invited. His name did not appear on any guest list. He had no official connection to General Hammond, no documented relationship that would justify his presence at such a high-profile ceremony. At 74 years old, he moved slowly but with the unmistakable bearing of someone who had spent his life in service to something larger than himself. Rodriguez had learned about the funeral from a brief mention in the Navy Times. He'd known General Hammond during her early career when she was still Colonel Hammond, working to establish new training protocols that would later become standard across all military branches. Their paths had crossed briefly but meaningfully during a joint training exercise in the early 1990s. She had been impressed by his work with military musicians, and he had respected her dedication to excellence in every aspect of military tradition. He had not come seeking recognition or attempting to insert himself into ceremonies where he didn't belong. He had simply come to pay his respects to a fellow service member who had made a difference. In his mind, that was what veterans did for each other. They showed up. They remembered. They honored the fallen regardless of bureaucratic protocols or social hierarchies. The funeral coordinator, David Whitman, had been managing high-profile military ceremonies for 15 years. He prided himself on flawless execution and strict adherence to protocol. When he spotted Rodriguez standing near the back of the seating area, his trained eye immediately identified a problem. The man's uniform, while properly maintained, was clearly vintage. His posture suggested military background, but his presence had not been cleared through proper channels. Whitman approached with the polished confidence of someone accustomed to handling delicate situations without creating scenes. He spoke quietly, professionally, with the tone of someone delivering non-negotiable instructions rather than making requests. "Excuse me, sir. I'm going to need to see your invitation and identification. This is a private ceremony, and I don't have you on the approved guest list." Rodriguez reached into his pocket and produced his military identification card, the one that designated him as a retired Master Chief Petty Officer with 32 years of active service. He had no invitation because he had not requested one. He had not thought one was necessary to attend the funeral of a fellow service member at a national cemetery. Sir, without proper authorization, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises. This ceremony is restricted to family members and specifically invited guests. I'm sure you understand the need for security protocols. Rodriguez looked toward the front of the ceremony where the military honor guard was making final preparations. A full Navy band was setting up their instruments, their uniforms immaculate, their movements precise. He recognized several faces among the musicians, though they were older now and he couldn't immediately place where he knew them from. I served with General Hammond in the early 90s. I came to pay my respects. Whitman's expression didn't change. I understand your desire to honor the general, but this is a private ceremony. There are public viewing opportunities at the base chapel later this week. Security will escort you to the exit. 2 security guards approached discreetly, their presence intended to encourage compliance without creating a disturbance. Rodriguez looked around at the gathering crowd of dignitaries and family members, understanding that he was being classified as an unwelcome intrusion rather than a fellow veteran paying his respects. He didn't argue, didn't protest, didn't attempt to explain his history or justify his presence. Military training had taught him when to follow orders, even when those orders felt wrong. He turned to leave, walking slowly between the security guards toward the cemetery exit. Behind him, the ceremony continued its preparations. The honor guard took their positions. The clergy reviewed their notes. Family members found their designated seats in the front rows. Everything proceeded according to the carefully orchestrated plan that had taken months to perfect. The Navy band, positioned to the side of the ceremony area, was conducting their final sound check. 23 musicians who represented the finest military musical tradition in the country. Their conductor, Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, had been leading military funeral ceremonies for 8 years. She demanded excellence from her musicians and had earned their respect through her own dedication to honoring the service and sacrifice of fallen heroes. As Rodriguez walked past the band area, one of the trumpet players looked up from his instrument. Something about the elderly man's bearing caught his attention. The way he carried himself, the precise alignment of his uniform despite its age, the measured pace of his steps even as he was being escorted away. Chief Petty Officer James Walsh had been playing trumpet in military ceremonies for 12 years. He had joined the Navy at 18 and had been assigned to the ceremonial band after demonstrating exceptional musical ability during basic training. But before he became the polished musician he was today, he had been a confused and intimidated young sailor struggling to understand military protocol and tradition. Walsh studied the elderly man's face as he passed, and suddenly recognition hit him like a physical blow. The man being escorted away from the ceremony was Master Chief Rodriguez, the naval instructor who had taught him everything he knew about military musical protocol 20 years ago. Rodriguez had been the senior enlisted instructor at the Navy School of Music when Walsh was a 19-year-old seaman trying to learn the complex requirements of ceremonial performance. He had been demanding but patient, strict about tradition but understanding of the challenges young musicians faced when transitioning from civilian to military life. Under Rodriguez's instruction, Walsh had learned not just how to play military music, but why it mattered. How each note carried the weight of honor and remembrance. How precision in performance was a form of respect for those being honored. How military musicians served as guardians of tradition that connected current service members to generations of sacrifice that came before. Walsh put down his trumpet and looked around at his fellow band members. He recognized at least 6 others who had been students during Rodriguez's tenure at the School of Music. Musicians who had learned their craft under the guidance of the man now being escorted away from the ceremony, as if he didn't belong. He caught the attention of Petty Officer Martinez, the band's principal clarinetist, and nodded toward Rodriguez. Her eyes widened with recognition. Then Petty Officer Thompson on French horn looked up and saw what was happening. Within moments, word was spreading through the band that their former instructor was being removed from the ceremony. Lieutenant Commander Martinez noticed the distraction among her musicians and looked to see what had captured their attention. She watched as the elderly veteran was escorted toward the exit, guided by security guards who treated him like a problem to be solved rather than a hero to be honored. Martinez had not been a student of Rodriguez herself, but she had heard the stories. Every military musician who had passed through the School of Music in the past 20 years knew about Master Chief Rodriguez. He was legendary for his dedication to excellence, his encyclopedic knowledge of military musical tradition, and his ability to transform young recruits into musicians worthy of honoring America's fallen heroes. The band members began looking at each other with expressions of disbelief and growing anger. They watched their teacher, the man who had shaped their understanding of military musical honor, being treated like an unwelcome intruder at the very type of ceremony he had trained them to perform. Walsh put down his trumpet completely and stepped toward Lieutenant Commander Martinez. "Ma'am, that's Master Chief Rodriguez. He taught most of us at the School of Music. He shouldn't be treated like this." Martinez looked toward the front of the ceremony, where funeral coordinator Whitman was checking his watch and preparing to signal the beginning of the service. She looked back at Rodriguez, now nearly at the cemetery exit, flanked by security guards who were ensuring his removal proceeded without incident. She made a decision that would change everything. Martinez raised her hand to signal for the band's attention. When 23 musicians turned toward her, she spoke in a voice that carried across the ceremony area with unmistakable authority. "Band at ease. We will not be performing today's ceremony." The immediate silence was deafening. Family members turned to look at the band. Dignitaries shifted in their seats. Funeral coordinator Whitman looked up from his clipboard with an expression of confusion that quickly shifted to alarm. Martinez continued, her voice carrying the kind of command presence that comes from years of military leadership. "Master Chief Rodriguez, our former instructor and the man who taught us our profession, is being removed from this ceremony. We cannot and will not perform without our teacher present." The declaration rippled through the gathering like a shockwave. Whitman immediately approached the band area, his professional composure barely containing his panic. "Lieutenant Commander, you need to begin the musical portion of the ceremony immediately. We're already behind schedule." Martinez didn't move. "Sir, Master Chief Rodriguez trained most of these musicians in proper funeral protocol. He deserves to be here more than any of us. Until he is properly seated and honored, this band will not play a single note." The standoff was unprecedented. A high-profile military funeral attended by some of the most powerful people in Washington, brought to a complete halt by musicians refusing to honor protocol because protocol was being used to dishonor their teacher. Whitman looked toward the family seating area, where General Hammond's children and grandchildren were watching the unfolding drama with expressions of confusion and concern. He looked toward the VIP section, where senators and generals were beginning to murmur among themselves about the delay. "Lieutenant Commander, this is highly irregular. The ceremony must proceed as scheduled." Martinez's response was calm but absolute. "Sir, everything we know about military funeral music, every tradition we uphold, every note we play in honor of our fallen heroes, we learned from the man you just had escorted away. We will not dishonor our teacher by performing the ceremony he taught us to honor." One by one, the other band members began putting down their instruments. Walsh placed his trumpet in its case. Martinez set down her clarinet. Thompson stepped away from his French horn. Within moments, 23 of the finest military musicians in the country were standing at attention, their instruments silent, their message clear. The ceremony had come to a complete halt. General Patricia Hammond's son, Colonel Robert Hammond, approached the band area. He had been watching the confrontation with growing understanding and something that looked like respect. As a career military officer himself, he understood the bonds between teachers and students, mentors and protégés, in ways that civilian funeral coordinators could not. "Lieutenant Commander, can you explain what's happening here?" Martinez turned toward Colonel Hammond with the respect due to both his rank and his relationship to the deceased. "Sir, Master Chief Rodriguez was our instructor at the Navy School of Music. He taught us everything we know about honoring fallen heroes through music. Your mother served with distinction, and she deserves the finest musical tribute we can provide. But we cannot provide that tribute while the man who taught us how to honor heroes is being treated as an unwelcome stranger." Colonel Hammond looked toward the cemetery exit where Rodriguez was still visible, flanked by security guards who were waiting for final instructions about his removal. He thought about his mother's dedication to military tradition and her respect for the non-commissioned officers who formed the backbone of military excellence. He turned to Whitman with an expression that carried all the authority of his rank and his position as the primary family representative. Bring Master Chief Rodriguez back immediately. Seat him in the front row with the family, and ensure he receives a formal apology for this misunderstanding. Whitman's face flushed with embarrassment and frustration, but he recognized that he had no choice. The ceremony could not proceed without music, and the band would not perform without their teacher present. He had created a situation that could only be resolved by reversing his earlier decision. Security, please escort Master Chief Rodriguez back to the ceremony area. He will be seated in the family section. The walk back across the cemetery grounds was unlike anything Rodriguez had experienced in his decades of military service. Word of the band's protest had spread through the gathering, and as he returned, escorted now as an honored guest rather than an unwelcome intruder, the assembled crowd began to understand what they were witnessing. Veterans in the audience stood as he passed. Active duty service members came to attention. Civilians who didn't fully understand the military significance of what was happening nevertheless recognized that they were witnessing something extraordinary. When Rodriguez reached the band area, Lieutenant Commander Martinez approached him with a salute that carried 20 years of gratitude and respect. Master Chief, it's an honor to have you here. Would you like to conduct the band for General Hammond's ceremony? Rodriguez returned her salute, his eyes reflecting emotions he didn't trust himself to voice. He looked at the young musicians who had once been his students, now accomplished professionals who had refused to perform without honoring their teacher. He thought about the lessons he had tried to teach them about duty, honor, and the importance of standing up for what was right. Lieutenant Commander, it would be my privilege to honor General Hammond alongside you. But this is your band now. You conduct. I'll just be grateful to witness the excellence you've achieved. Rodriguez was escorted to a seat in the front row, directly beside Colonel Hammond and the family members who had specifically requested his presence. The ceremony that had been delayed by his removal was now enhanced by his return. Lieutenant Commander Martinez raised her baton, and 23 musicians prepared to deliver a musical tribute that honored both the fallen general and the teacher who had shaped their understanding of what such honor meant. The first notes of Amazing Grace rose across Arlington National Cemetery with a precision and emotion that seemed to transform the very air around the gathering. Every note carried the weight of tradition passed from teacher to student, from one generation of service to the next. As the ceremony proceeded, Rodriguez sat quietly among the family members, his presence a living reminder that military honor transcended bureaucratic protocol. He was no longer the unwelcome stranger who had been escorted away, but the honored teacher whose students had refused to perform without him. When the band played Taps, the final tribute to General Hammond, Rodriguez's eyes filled with tears he had held back for decades. Not just for the general being honored, but for the students who had become such accomplished musicians, and for the moment when they had chosen honor over obedience, principle over protocol. After the ceremony, as the crowd began to disperse, Colonel Hammond approached Rodriguez personally. Master Chief, I want to thank you for coming today, and I want to apologize for the way you were initially treated. Rodriguez shook the colonel's hand with the firm grip of one military professional acknowledging another. Colonel, your mother was a remarkable officer and an even better person. It was my honor to be here for her. But more than that, Rodriguez had witnessed something that reminded him why he had dedicated his life to teaching young service members about tradition, honor, and the importance of standing up for what was right. His students had become teachers themselves, passing on lessons that went far beyond musical technique. The story of Master Chief Rodriguez and the band that refused to play without him spread through military circles within days. It became a reminder that respect and honor were not determined by guest lists or seating charts, but by the relationships between people who had dedicated their lives to serving something larger than themselves. The musicians who had stood up for their teacher discovered that their act of defiance had actually been an act of military tradition at its finest. They had honored their teacher, their service, and their fallen general by refusing to allow bureaucratic oversight to diminish the ceremony they had been trained to perform. Lieutenant Commander Martinez received commendations for her leadership during the incident. But more importantly, she had learned that sometimes the most military thing to do was to refuse to follow orders that violated military values. Rodriguez returned to his quiet retirement, but with a new understanding of the impact his teaching had made. His students had not just learned to play military music, they had learned to embody military values. And when those values were tested, they had chosen honor over convenience, loyalty over protocol. The incident led to changes in how high-profile military ceremonies were planned and managed. Guest list protocols were revised to ensure that deserving veterans were not inadvertently excluded. Procedures were established to verify the military background and connections of individuals seeking to attend ceremonial events. But the most important change was less tangible and more profound. The story became part of military folklore, a reminder that true honor cannot be scheduled or protocol managed. It exists in the relationships between people who serve, the respect they show for each other, and their willingness to stand up for what is right, even when it disrupts carefully laid plans. Master Chief Rodriguez had taught his students more than musical technique. He had taught them that military musicians serve as guardians of tradition, custodians of honor, and voices for values that transcend individual ceremonies or careers. When his students refused to perform without him, they demonstrated that they had learned the most important lesson of all, that honoring heroes means honoring all heroes, regardless of whether their names appear on guest lists or their stories fit neatly into planned narratives. The band that stopped playing became legendary not for their musical excellence, but for their moral courage. They had shown that true military discipline sometimes means refusing to follow orders that violate the very principles military service is meant to protect. Rodriguez had spent his career teaching young musicians how to honor fallen heroes through music. His students had honored him by refusing to dishonor their teacher. In doing so, they had created a moment of military honor that transcended any individual ceremony and reminded everyone present what service really meant. Sometimes the most powerful music is the silence that occurs when musicians refuse to play until honor is properly restored. Sometimes the greatest tribute to military tradition is the courage to break with protocol in order to uphold military values. And sometimes the most important lesson a teacher can receive is the moment when students demonstrate that they learn not just the techniques of their profession, but the principles that make their profession meaningful. This story was brought to you by the Human Stories. Before we leave you today, here's our question. Have you ever known someone who never asked for recognition but deserved more than anyone else? Tell us in the comments what they meant to you and how you remember them. And if you think stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button to support the channel. We'll see you in the next one.